Welcome to Back to the Text Themselves, a series on phenomenology. Today's video examines sections 72 to 77 of Heidegger's Being and Time. As of this fall, I will have been doing this YouTube thing for 2 years. I began by posting psychology videos for students in my courses. However, before I got too far in framing this as a psychology-only channel, I realized I could use this platform to do something I truly love and what I've been limited from doing in my role as a psychology professor, that being philosophy and theory. Since college, where I double majored in psychology and philosophy, I constantly chose a practical path. I went to graduate school in psychology rather than philosophy. Then, when it came time to define my career trajectory toward a more philosophical and psychoanalytic approach to psychology, I ended up choosing neuropsychology, again motivated by practical considerations. And yet, I kept going back to philosophy with whatever spare time I had over and beyond my practical responsibilities. Now, presented with this new opportunity in the happenstance of having to produce videos in light of the pandemic, this time I decided in favor of my passion and not merely utility. After all, psychology channels do get far more traffic than philosophy and theory channels do. Many of those who are in my life tend to be oriented to the values of professional recognition, financial benefit, social action, measurable utility, and they tend to see what I do here at best as rather confusing and at worst a form of irresponsible intellectualizing, devoid of any practical import. And yet, when I think about what I would regret more, losing out on a kind of lifestyle and recognition and persisting in the direction deemed more recognizable and praiseworthy by others, or losing out on the opportunity to immerse myself in a life of thought that makes me see the world differently, and to share that experience with others who care for that sort of thing. And it's not even a close call for me if I put it in those terms. So, how I'm framing my story here with the channel is one that stretches out over the past and heads toward a future. I think of previous choices I've made, choices shaped by circumstances from my early past that I had been thrown into and that I won't get into here. I also think of the heritage I've been thrown into, an American heritage that places priority on certain values, one of them often being utility and the equation of one's worth with one's work and income. I also think of those choices in light of having been thrown into a life fated for an inevitable end, that my decisions have meaning not just in what they are moving away from, but also in what they are moving toward. In other words, my story has a history. That history is not a static recounting of facts strung together sequentially, but is related to meaningfully in light of my thrown existence as a being in the present who is also a having been and a being toward. And I can only have such a history because I am and move within an ecstatic and horizontal temporality. And to make choices that break with what others think I should do means that my history is first and foremost grounded in my future and not my past. In this video, we'll consider the meaning of historicity as the concrete movement of Dasein in its existential and temporal conditions of possibility. We'll contrast this with the vulgar notions of history. Finally, we'll examine what it means to be authentically and inauthentically historical. Thus, the interpretation of the historicity of Dasein turns out to be basically just a more concrete elaboration of temporality. Although Heidegger has emphasized one boundary that encompasses the totality of Dasein, he is not unaware of the other boundary, birth. Dasein is not only a being toward death, but also is a being toward the beginning. Yet these beginnings and ends are not some unreality that's surrounding the real present of my existence, Birth is never something merely past, and death is not something future yet to come. Birth and death are always connected to Dasein, who, as care, is identified with the very in between, whose being stretches itself out across the ends of the frame of birth and death. This movement of Dasein stretching itself out, Heidegger calls the occurrence. The structure of these occurrences, including their existential and temporal conditions of possibility, is made evident in historicity. And as you see here, the German better demonstrates the connection between what is being translated as historicity and occurrence. As mentioned in the introduction to Being and Time, historicity is distinguished from history as an academic discipline. The phenomenon of historicity precedes and makes possible this discipline. The objective study of history only makes sense to a being that already possesses a historicity and is rooted in temporality. Nonetheless, we have to distinguish between different ways by which we are historical beings, that being the authentic and inauthentic modes. We begin with the inauthentic mode, taking up what Heidegger calls the vulgar understanding of history. Vulgar here is simply a way of describing the common everyday way we're within history. Heidegger asks, what is meant by history and being historical in this vulgar interpretation of Dasein? He provides 4 responses to this question. First, there is history understood as objectively present, what is called historical reality, and what we might associate with the academic discipline of history. Second, there is the past, which is no longer objectively present, but without any effect or consequence to my present. Third, history refers to what is past, but still significant, still consequential. It is the reverberation of the past in the present. These last 2 interpretations of history move away from the scientific study of it, but both do make history derivative of the present, its significance or insignificance being determined by my here and now. And some may interpret some forms of psychology and in particular psychoanalysis as promoting such a view. Here, the present determines whether or not the past is of any consequence. Fourth, history is a kind of collective phenomenon, the making history or epoch that transforms humankind and human institutions. It's a kind of nexus event that forms part of the broader cultural spirit. And I do wonder if Heidegger has Hegel in mind here. As interesting as this breakdown of the 4 senses of history are, they're each derivative of a more fundamental situation belonging to the being of Dasein. These histories are only because Dasein is historical, and Dasein is historical because its being is grounded in temporality. Or more precisely, as Heidegger writes, thus the interpretation of the historicity of Dasein turns out to be basically just a more concrete elaboration of temporality. Heidegger provides an example of encountering an artifact on display in a museum. The artifact is objectively present, but what justifies considering such an artifact historical? What delivers it a past? It's that these artifacts belong to another world within which they had been encountered as things at hand belonging to that larger context of relevance consisting of the totality of useful things that had once been used by Dasein existing in the world. And this is a Dasein that no longer exists, having been there for whom what is now encountered as objectively present was at one point interworldly. And so we can see how even something as removed as possible from a primordial sense of historicity still finds its grounding in the being of Dasein. Authentic being toward death, that is, the finitude of temporality, is the concealed ground of the historicity of Dasein. Section 74 returns to Dasein in its authentic mode of existence. In anticipatory resoluteness, Dasein beholds the uncanniness of its world in anxiety in confronting our potentiality of being whole in one's being toward death. This, in turn, allows us to return to our thrownness and the factical possibilities that may now be discovered. This resolute coming back to oneself and disclosing actual factual possibilities of authentic existing, Heidegger claims, is to hand oneself over to a heritage of traditional possibilities. Heritage refers to an existential awareness of one's tradition as what meaningfully determines the world one finds oneself in. Heidegger is quick to add here that this handing oneself over to a heritage of traditional possibilities is not necessarily to appropriate them as traditional possibilities. This anticipatory handing oneself over to a heritage is what Heidegger calls fate. Here, fate is not about the coming together of circumstances and events, nor even what was determined in the past, but instead refers to the future that one may freely and resolutely choose. So it's not the same notion as the sense of fate we find in the Greek tragedies, for example. Instead, we might say we're fated for death. We are born with the inevitable possibility of our own demise. However, rather than something that fully determines us, as the word fate often connotes, it's in confronting the powerlessness of our fate whereby we understand ourselves in the power of our finite freedom. Destiny has to do with a kind of collective fate. The occurrences of fateful Dasein are always an occurrence with, since Dasein is always being in the world with others. Destiny is not the sum of individual fates, but pertains to the one shared world of our being with one another. Like fate, destiny is also grounded in the anticipatory handing oneself down in resoluteness. In this resolute handing down, we come to understand both our fate and our destiny. Heidegger calls this resolute handing down repetition. We recently encountered this term as an authentic mode of relating to the past that contrasts with forgetfulness. A fateful destiny always encircles Dasein, but it's only through repetition that one comes to explicitly fetch from the traditional understanding of one's particular factical possibilities. It's the explicit handing down or going back to the possibilities of Dasein that has always already been there. Heidegger selects the notable example in which one chooses their hero, whereby Dasein may authentically repeat those possibilities associated with the hero. In Resoluteness, Dasein chooses to be free for the struggle of what is to come and to be faithful to what can be repeated. As such, authentic repetition is the handing down of a possibility. Yet, Heidegger is clear that such repetition is not about bringing back the past for the sake of the past, nor is it abandoning oneself to the past. At the same time, repetition does not aim at progress necessarily. Authentic existence is indifferent to these conservative or progressive approaches. Instead, repetition is the resolute handing down of oneself by which we may exist explicitly as fated and destined. And so, fateful destiny is explicitly disclosed in repetition as it is bound up with the heritage handed down to us, which first manifests to us our history. Now, much has been made of these passages in light of Heidegger's later political positions. Some looking for hints at a kind of nationalistic and conservative tendency will often turn to them, especially when it comes to talking about the destiny of a people and choosing a hero. This is despite Heidegger's at least explicit attempt to distance himself here from the political. Are these the seeds of thought that will later lead to his aligning with the far-right National Socialist German Workers' Party? And if there is a relationship for Heidegger's own thinking, do the notions of repetition and the appropriation of traditional possibilities in a non-traditional manner necessarily entail an alignment to far-right ideology? I leave these questions open for your own consideration on this matter. The main point of the preceding analyses is to demonstrate how authentic historicity originates from the future and not, first of all, from the past. Fate marks the primordial historicity of Dasein, but since fate first refers us to the future, then history itself has its roots essentially in the future as well. What is historical about Dasein, then, is that our death throws our anticipatory existence back upon our factical thrownness, and as such gives to our having been its unique priority in what is historical. As Heidegger writes, authentic being toward death, that is, the finitude of temporality, is the concealed ground of the historicity of Dasein. If you find this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is in the video description. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also support this channel by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. And as always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.